Welcome to the Business of Family, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and opportunities of family businesses. I'm your host, Tammy Buss, and I'm a family business survivor, and I'm also a family business advisor. In this show, we'll be talking with family business leaders and experts to bring you insights and inspiration so you too can survive your family business journey. Whether you're a founder, a successor, a professional, or just curious about family business, this podcast is for you. So I'd like to welcome back to our show today Dr. Sarah Burrows. Dr. Burrows is a professor of entrepreneurship in the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. If you didn't catch her first podcast, go take a look. It was really good, or take a listen. So her research interests are in the area of entrepreneurship and family business. She focuses on leveraging her background in psychology to understand how family dynamics influence the management of the firm and entrepreneurship across generations. So our last conversation, we were chatting about well-being versus ill-being. We had a bunch of conversation about that, but we also talked about fair and equitable. So I have her back today to have a discussion or a debate on fair versus equitable. So welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me back, Tammy.
So we ended our last podcast by talking about, fair versus equitable. I think that was one of the tips you gave. So let's just take a step back and talk a little bit about, for those people who have not listened to the previous podcast, a little bit about what you're focusing on at the Smith School of Business at Queen's in Kingston.
So just the background here is I've just always been fascinated by family-owned businesses. We are mixing like these two foundational institutions of a family system and a business system, both of which are complex enough on their own. And then when you kind of marry the two, that just adds to the complexities. And so I'm really passionate about digging into understanding the family system and how really what goes on in the family ultimately ends up influencing what's happening in the business. And then with the recognition that the reverse can also be true, that it's oftentimes really hard to just kind of step away and ignore what's happening in the business. Oftentimes, that the boardroom can also bleed into the living room and vice versa.
Yes, yes. And as a family business advisor, we talk about this all the time, is understanding the circles, the systems, however you want to define them, as the family, the business, and the ownership. And there is basically succession, and I'm dealing mainly with helping families align for succession, not necessarily agree, but at least have an understanding of what's happening. And they're in the three systems, the family, the business, and the ownership. There's succession, but there's also a distribution of potential assets, whether that be, and roles. So succession overlaps, and there's that fair versus equitable debate that comes in there because you get different perspectives depending on where you're sitting in those systems and where they overlap. And we've talked a little bit about overlap, but maybe you can give our listeners just a brief description of the overlapping between those three circles.
Yeah, definitely. And so essentially, as you mentioned, there's the family system, there's the business system, and then there's the ownership system. And so you can hold these different hats or have these different roles. So as a family member that is a part of a business family, so that you own a family business, you could decide to just be a family member. Or you could be a family member that is also working in the business system. So here we're talking about being an employee, or you could decide to be a family member, an employee, and also have ownership. But also sometimes what happens is you could decide to be a family member. You don't want to be actively involved, but instead you're more of a passive shareholder because you still own shares in the ownership system. So that leads to a multitude of complexities. And to your point, when we're thinking about things like what it means to be fair versus what it means to be equitable, depending on what hat you're wearing, that can skew how you view those concepts.
Absolutely. And the biggest or the most common I guess, what I run into is that when you have a family member who's working in the business and a family member who's not working in the business.
Right.
And so when it comes down to succession planning or estate planning, which are completely different, but a lot of times you think of them as the same, but they're really not, is you have in the family circle, could be a mom, could be anybody who wants to be fair, um, or equal. And then you have the person who's in the business saying, hold on, it's not fair that my
Hmm.
sibling gets shares in a company that I worked 20 years. So this fair versus equitable or equal or however, we'll get into it,
Hmm.
is a really big stumbling block for families and
Hmm.
causes a lot of, from what I've seen, a lot of issues in terms of if you're working in the business or you're not. And I think that's when we're talking about what hat are you wearing, if you're in the family hat and the lens you're looking through, from a estate perspective as
Hmm.
opposed to a succession, event that happens with the business, for example, which is only could be a small percentage of the whole family enterprise,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, and I think I love your example because it not only points to the different roles that you might hold, but also just that the perspectives also vary across like the stakeholders involved, whether it might be perceived as fair on behalf of the parent, the mom, let's say in that example, but not so much when it's the sibling that has been actively involved for so many years. Their perceptions of fairness are very different. And that again is influenced by that role that they are holding.
And I think it comes down to a little bit of governance within the ownership, or sorry, yeah, within the ownership circle. I think the deeper the generations you get, the more clarity around that there is because you've already experienced it once or twice, perhaps. But when you're in the founder role, or you maybe a second gen because however you got the ownership, whether it be through a death or disability or you're an only child, you really didn't have that structure in place. So this is where it really becomes complex in
Mhm.
having that discussion. So let's dive into it a little
Okay.
bit. Let's talk about what's fair.
Yeah. All right. So I think maybe a good place to start off would be just like defining what we mean by these terms.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
and fair within maybe each system.
Yes, I think that does look differently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think when I find that these terms are often used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think when we speak about fairness, and actually I looked up the official definition in the Oxford Dictionary, and it basically the definition is to treat people equally or the sense of treating them like reasonably. And so I think oftentimes we associate fairness with treating people equally. And equality is very different, or fairness is very different than the concept of equity or treating people equitably. And so fundamentally, the difference between the two is this equality or fairness approach basically involves giving people equal opportunity, but not recognizing the kind of the different starting points and the kind of individual constraints that these individuals may have. Versus equitable is about really recognizing that people come from, different places in life, have different skills, opportunities, and making sure that we are adapting to their needs to really provide kind of a fair and just approach. And for me, I think there is an amazing infographic that has been circulating online. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's a picture depicting differences between equality versus equity, and it uses the picture of three kids at different heights trying to look at a baseball game. Have you seen this
Oh, no, I have
circulate?
not, but that's yeah, I like that.
So essentially, this is a really nice kind of visual representation to kind of get at the differences between these two key terms. And very briefly, what it shows is under an equal approach, you have these three kids that are at different heights, and there's a fence in front of them, and they're trying to overlook a baseball game. And obviously the kid that is quite tall can see the baseball game no problem, while the shorter two cannot. And so an equal approach, you would give each of those kids the same sized box because we're trying to be equal.
Right.
But that would just continue to allow the tallest person to continue to see the baseball
Yeah.
game. The medium height kid will now be able to see it, but the shortest kid, perhaps the toddler, wouldn't no longer still wouldn't still be able to see it.
Right.
So again, this idea that equality doesn't necessarily always lead to fair outcomes, whereas an equitable approach, talking is hard sometimes, the tallest kid doesn't need a boost. The medium kid might need one box, and the shortest child might need two boxes. So getting at the idea
Right.
that there are different needs and different resources.
Absolutely. And that's an easy description when you're talking about a baseball game.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about the family business or the assets, and I
Yeah.
think this is where a lot of struggles happen. I think a lot of it is lack of communication. Let's just throw it out there right now. It's
Mhm.
not communicating because you will have families who say, well, Sarah, doesn't really have as great of an income as Tammy, so therefore we should support her more.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
then it's like, well, you mean so because you're successful, you don't get as much of the family business or as much as the estate? How does that work? And so then that
Mhm.
becomes what makes sense? What is fair versus equal? What
Mhm.
if it's the family business? So let's dive into if you have a child in the business who's been working in it for 20 years
Yeah.
and a child who's not been involved in the business, but that's the largest part of the estate,
Mhm.
right? So there's where an issue becomes because you always have one parent is going to say it needs to be equal.
Mhm.
Everybody needs to have the same. This is the business.
Yeah.
However, the child in the business says, hold on here a second. I spent 20 years building this. I don't want my sister as my new partner or my two siblings as equal partners.
Mhm.
And maybe in dad in this case says, hold on here a second. I think a child in the business deserves more because of the effort they've put in. So
Yep.
what's your thought on this?
Yes. Um, so I have many thoughts on this. I think um, what I've often seen is especially so when we're talking about the fair versus equitable in the context of ownership. So how are we divvying up the assets that we have? Oftentimes what I've seen the parents, the founding generation, they decide to be fair and to limit the amount of kind of infighting within siblings from an ownership perspective, we'll just divvy it up equally. But to your point, that can cause feelings of resentment among siblings when in reality this equality approach that you tried to implement was to completely avoid that scenario. And so I think with that, if there is a preference to provide equal distribution of ownership, think that there are ways that we could still implement that with some tweaks to make kind of both parties happy. So for instance, I think one of the bigger issues that I see is that the siblings, the next gen, especially the one that is involved in the day-to-day in the business system, doesn't think it's right that their other brother and sister that isn't involved, that are passive shareholders, have now a say of the strategic direction of the firm. And so kind of teasing apart ownership versus voting rights and having the ability to implement strategic directions of the firm or leadership decisions. So that's one potential solution. And another one being rather than simply divvying up ownership equally, potentially make it based on like a performance base. So that way, though that individual who is also working in the business gets an additional kind of bump when it comes to the dividends because of them being directly involved in like the operations and the actual profit that comes.
And I think that every family is different, but on what they decide to do. But one of the things that we talk about a lot with our families is understanding the whole family enterprise
Yeah.
is not just the operating company. There could be several operating companies, right? There could be one company that maybe generates the most income, but you could have potentially, real estate, which is another, could be carved off to another business. And so what we try to do is to educate the family in the sense that doesn't have to be everybody gets a third, a third, a third of absolutely everything. It's a matter of what does the family really want? And fair versus equal or equitable is here's the whole entire family enterprise. Here's the value of this, you know, going forward. And what do you really want as a legacy? Does this need to be a family business? What does this look like? And if the decision is that the operating company goes to the person involved in the business, that's great. But then it'll be equalized with other assets on the other side. And I guess we weren't going to get into the tax liability and all that stuff around that, but it becomes there are ways to, I think, deal with this equitable, fair, equal. Again, they're very interchangeable, and to understand what it means to you and your family. Because this is generally an issue that's first and second gen. Like once you
Mm-hmm.
go deeper, you're going to find that the deeper the generations, you might not have anybody actually actively working in the business.
Right.
It's that founder second gen that becomes the struggle with the families. How do I divide this? I've got 4 kids in the business, and one not. And 4 in the business are not equal in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
work they do or their capabilities. How does that work?
Yeah.
Right? So I think in a lot of cases we have to take away those three circles and look at them, or those
Mm-hmm.
3 systems and look at them independently.
Yeah.
What's equal or equitable from an estate, what's fair and equitable from ownership of
Mm-hmm.
operating or holding companies, and then what's fair and equitable within the business itself in terms of roles and income, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing that you touched upon that really resonated with me is that it it ultimately is very much dependent on each business family. And so this idea of like a one size fits all approach to succession or to anything involved in the family business, I think it sounds like we would both very much push back on that. It's about having these open conversations within the context of your own family and figuring out what's best for you and putting it all out on the table.
Because I think you're right. At the beginning, you talked about, what position you're in and where are you overlapping. Because depending on where you are, you're looking at things from a different perspective. So if you're a family member who has no, say you're a mom or a dad who has no ownership stake in any of the operating companies, doesn't have a position, a paid position, employee position in one of the companies, all you're thinking about is I just need my kids to be treated equally,
Mhm.
right? But then again, that causes a problem because from equitable versus fair going, but I have a child who needs more help. Like
Mhm.
these other ones are so good. They have, great relationships. They have high incomes. Their spouses are doing well. They don't need as much support, which causes its own issue.
Mhm.
And then into the business, well, they're making so much money, they have all these perks of being working in the family business, and I'm not. That's not fair. Oh, but
Mhm.
is that equitable? Like, and I
Yeah.
always use the example that if you work for 3M, When you start and you get a car for your job, the
Mm-hmm.
HR manager doesn't say to you, by the way, Sarah, do you have any siblings that we should give a car to? Is there something that we need to give them? No, because
Yeah,
understanding that's a
it's a great
role as an
example.
employee,
Yeah.
right, in the business. And then the
Yeah.
ownership, again, you briefly touched on it, voting shares, non-voting shares. What does
Mm-hmm.
this look like and how do you maintain that legacy if that's what the family wants?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that example of the 3M, and especially, and I think then thinking about it through like the sibling's perspective, that sibling who might be harboring feelings of jealousy or resentment towards that child that is in the business and is getting the company car or whatnot, they're not using the general employee hat that they would wear.
Mm,
They're wearing their sibling hat, thinking about it in the context of like, well, my brother or my sister is getting more, and that's not fair.
yes.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies when you're the one in the business with the
Hmm.
car.
Yep.
That now all of a sudden your other siblings get a car because you got a car at work. How is that fair?
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes a very complex. I love that. I love this, fair versus equitable,
Hmm.
because it really is complex. And again, it's not a one size fits all. It's really about the three circles, the three systems, and how do you do fair versus equitable. So if you had to pick a side, what side would
Ooh.
you pick?
I think I would go with equitable, especially in the context. So not just we've spoken a lot about ownership, but I think also what I find that this gets even complicated in the context of the business side when let's say you have two kids that are working in the family business. I've seen things go awry when they're given, let's say, co-positions, so they're made co-CEOs.
Mm,
And so now they don't each kind of have their own lane, so to speak. And so and again, that's often from this idea of fairness. And so I would push more for an equitable approach, especially as I think about the other stakeholders involved and just thinking about the idea that it's about giving opportunity to those that have the relevant skills and capabilities and also the desire to do it. And I think that that's not only important from a family system, but that's also important from a wider business system in terms of the other employees that are there and what they're witnessing and what they're perceiving as fair versus equitable. Because typically the distribution, especially as the family business grows, about 80% of your employee force is non-family. And
mhm.
so it's really important to also consider how they view things because they're a key part of keeping that family business prospering.
So do you think, and I would take the fair side, but I think it's the same part as the
Okay.
equitable side, right?
Okay.
When the definition, because if you look at people say fair versus equal, fair
Yes.
versus equitable, I think fair and equitable are almost interchangeable, where
Yeah.
equal is not. Because fair in the sense that I would say fair as opposed to equal, because I do think that there's things you have to take into consideration of what
Mhm.
is fair in the business circle, in the ownership circle, and in the
Yeah.
family circle.
Yeah.
Fair in the sense that, well, we've helped Sarah a lot. So we're going to deduct that off, her portion. So
Yeah.
that's fair. It doesn't mean at the
Right.
end it's equal, but it's fair. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately
Mm-hmm.
it is equal in the sense that we helped you more along the way.
Right.
And we're helping your siblings on our passing. But I
Yeah.
think the issue maybe should be around equitable versus equal. And I think they
Yes.
sometimes are interchangeable, like I said, in this description, because I would say be fair as opposed to equal. I don't think equal, in my opinion, is that just doesn't work very well. Yes, you think you're doing the best job for your family, but I don't think without a lot of explanation that it doesn't create some chaos or some jealousy or some tension in the family. So if you were going to define, I guess, equitable and equal, what would you say the differences are?
Yeah. So I think then it comes down to the idea that potentially if we reframe this a bit, it sounds like Equal might then be the idea of sameness, giving everyone the same distribution of shares, let's say, whereas equitable is much more aligned with a fairness approach and in taking like the individual considerations and not just doing everything the same for everyone just because they're the sake of they're all part of the family.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing. Because we do have a lot of fair versus equal, but we don't see a lot of fair versus equitable. I
Hmm.
think as a discussion, whether they mean it in the equitable or equal is again the sameness, and I think sameness is
Yeah.
probably where I'm not in alignment with. I'm
Yeah,
more about
I
the
would agree.
fair, depending on what's happened over the course of your
Hmm.
lifetime and what's
Yep.
happened within your family mix. But if we're believe it or not, we're out of time again. That's how fast it goes.
Time flies.
So, I always like to end with three, but I'm going to ask you to give us three tips, but three tips on how to navigate fair versus equal.
Oof, okay. Um,
Nothing like putting you
hmm.
on the spot.
Yeah.
I should have sent
I
you some notes.
okay, so I'll steal one of my earlier nuggets in our conversation. I think it's really important to emphasize one size fits all approach does not work. And so for each business family to know that, especially if they might be having conversations with other business families and what they do what's best for your family, and only you could truly know that based on your dynamics. The second would be, I think, to really to help with this process. I think so many times we are focused on firm governance. So, for instance, how drafting a shareholder agreement could be really helpful in terms of thinking through ownership versus voting rights. Um, but I don't think we talk enough about family governance and the role that that can play. So, thinking about forming a family council and writing a family constitution, really writing out what are our guiding values, our traditions, to really, because that is a form of communication across the different family members, and that should be helping inform the firm governance. Um, my third nugget. I think I said this in my last one, but um, like seek expert help. This is a really difficult thing to do on your own, especially as you mentioned, there are generational differences, and it gets easier. It could get easier, but it could also get more complex with
Well, yeah,
time.
it's more complex. It's more
Right.
complex, but you end up having more governance in place.
Exactly. And
Something has
so,
gone wrong, so you've
yes.
written a policy on it.
Exactly. So get that help before something has gone wrong in those first and second generations.
That's a good advice for just about anything, actually.
Fair.
No, I think it's really important, and the one thing I think that becomes a little overwhelming is when you talk about family councils, because when you're a family of four, and maybe a couple of spouses in there, it's very difficult to start that process, but it's important that you start having those conversations. And I think that's the hardest part to go, why should we bother? We have dinner every Sunday. We just talk about it then. But I do think that that's important. So thank you so much for joining
Thank
us
you.
again. I think
Yes.
this was very valuable. I think it's is it the cart and the horse? It's the fair versus equal, right?
Hmm.
It's that conversation that comes up over and over again, or fair versus equitable. So anyway, thank you, Dr. Burrows, for joining us again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast, Tammy.
If you like this episode, subscribe to the Business of Family podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can also find Blue Roots on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On the next show, I'll be back with another amazing guest who will inspire you with their family business insights. Until then, take care and keep it in the family. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, investment, or insurance advice. Before acting on any advice, please contact your personal or company advisors.